Stories Philippines Podcast.
A darkness permeates this episode, touching on scenes and themes some may find deeply unsettling. The journey ahead is shadowed by sorrow and profound loss. Listener discretion is a necessity. There are places where silence is heavier than any scream, where the air itself feels thick with secrets, and the land seems to remember every moment of sorrow. Imagine standing at the edge of a vanished village, the wind carrying not only the scent of wet earth, but the faintest impression of voices that will never be heard again. What happens when an entire community is swallowed whole, leaving behind no witnesses, only the unbearable weight of memory? Can a place mourn its own people? And if so, how does that grief echo through the soil, the rivers, the dreams of those who remain? Tonight's story is not about what survived, but about what was erased. It is about the city of silent screams. In its empty streets, the shadows move like old regrets, and in its abandoned houses, the curtains still seem to stir with gestures that once belonged to living hands. You will hear about doors that close by themselves long after their owners are gone, and windows that catch moonlight in ways that make the past look as present as the pavement beneath your feet. The maps have been redrawn, the official names erased, yet the earth remembers footprints no longer visible and registers a grief that refuses to be mapped away. Prepare yourself for a tale that listens closely to absence, that measures loss not in bodies but in the ways laughter thinned and light left the rooms. We will follow the echoes that move like low tides through the city's bones, echoes that carry stories of ordinary lives interrupted, of rituals abandoned in mid-gesture, of photographs left face down on mantels. This is a story of erasure and remembrance, of how silence can be as loud and as fatal as any shout. I am Jessica, and you are listening to Stories Philippines Podcast. This is Season 5, Episode 5, The City of Silent Screams, the Guinsaogon Landslide. The rain had not stopped for days. In the town of St. Bernard, southern Leyte, the mountains hung heavy and shrouded in mist, their ridgelines blurred by endless sheets of water. On the 17th of February 2006, the villagers of Guinsaogon woke to another morning of gray skies and the constant, distant sound of water moving through the hills. People rose and went about their routines under the damp air. Children gathered for classes in the elementary school, their voices bright and eager despite the weather. At the community center, women came together to mark the 5th anniversary of the local health association, sitting close, sharing stories and laughing quietly with neighbors, unaware that these would be their last moments together. At 10:45 in the morning, a light tremor ran through the ground, just enough to rattle windows and put a nervous edge in the air. Then, from the heart of Mount Canabag, a sound erupted unlike any they had known. Survivors would later describe it as the world collapsing in on itself, a roar so deep and powerful it seemed to split the sky. The mountain gave way. Tons of earth, stone, and uprooted trees thundered down in an unstoppable surge, a wave taller than any house and faster than any fleeing animal, overwhelming homes, the school, rice fields, and every path that might have offered escape. In less than a minute, Guinsaogon was gone, swallowed by the sudden, brutal movement of the hillside. The silence that followed was absolute. No one cried for help. No one could. The land itself became a grave. Over 1,800 people lived in Guinsaogon, a small barangay tucked into the steep folds of the Leyte Highlands. Only 53 survived. Among the dead were 246 children and 7 teachers, lost in the school that had been the center of play and learning for the village's youngest. Entire families disappeared as if they had never existed. Parents, grandparents, aunts and uncles, newborns, leaving meals still steaming in pots, toys abandoned in yards, and shoes standing by doorways. A whole village was wiped from the map, leaving behind only the faint outline of roads, the ruined skeletons of houses swallowed by mud, and the echo of daily routines that would never return. The rescue that followed was frantic, chaotic, and ultimately futile against the mass of earth and water. Rains continued without mercy, turning the mud into choking quicksand that swallowed shovels, boots, and hope. International teams arrived. American soldiers redirected from nearby training exercises, Japanese engineers with heavy equipment, Filipino volunteers from neighboring towns and cities, all working in a landscape that resisted recovery. The village had been buried under almost 30 meters of earth in places. Entire hills seemed to have flown downhill and frozen in place. Helicopters circled overhead, searching for signs of life with spotlights and heat sensors, but found only the implacable face of a mountainside newly remade and already ancient. A few survivors were pulled from the outer edge of the debris, dazed and silent, their clothes torn, faces ashen. Many of them could not comprehend what had happened, stumbling between shock and a numbing grief. In the aftermath, scientists, officials, and ordinary people worldwide tried to explain what had gone wrong. Some pointed first of all to the endless rain. 1,200 millimeters fell in just 2 weeks, a deluge greater than Metro Manila typically receives in a month during even a severe typhoon such as Ondoy. Others blamed the geology itself. Mount Canabag's slopes were notoriously steep, its layers of volcanic rock fractured by ancient eruptions and torn open over centuries by wind and water, weakened further by years of erosion and by widespread tree cutting for timber and farmland. Some engineers noted that a minor earthquake, magnitude 2.6, barely felt by most, had occurred just before the slide, perhaps the last small trigger needed to set the unstable mass moving. Still others pointed to human settlement patterns, poverty that pushed people to build on marginal land, and the failure of early warning systems. But for the people of Leyte, and for generations who still whisper about Guinsalgon, technical explanations are never quite enough. In a culture that keeps close company with the land, the terrain is not inert. It is animated by memory and meaning. The earth remembers. It punishes perceived transgressions, and it mourns with those who remain. Stories spread in the weeks and years after the tragedy, of the hill that sighed, of the water that ran in new channels, of the nights when the wind seemed to carry voices. Becoming part of local mourning and lore, the loss reshaped the community's relationship to place, to safety, and to the delicate balance between people and the mountains that sustain them. In the days after the landslide, stories began to circulate more urgently and more insistently than anyone had expected. Some claimed to see pale lights moving across the buried village at night, dancing orbs that bobbed and drifted like lanterns carried by an invisible hand, flickering like candles left out for the souls of the dead. Others reported hearing faint cries beneath the earth, small sounds that rose and fell as if someone were trapped in a shallow throat of mud, or the sound of children's laughter coming from the fields, bright and mocking, rising and then abruptly vanishing when anyone dared to approach. These tales did not come from casual rumor mongers or passing tourists, but from the survivors themselves. Men and women who had lost their homes, their kin, their livelihoods. People whose lives had been cleaved in half by the night's collapse, and who therefore turned to the unseen for some kind of explanation, or perhaps simply for comfort. A listener later submitted a story to us, recounting how their aunt, one of the volunteers who had spent long hours at the rescue site, described the air as heavy with sorrow. She spoke of a pervasive feeling that thousands of eyes watched the living from beneath the mud, an imagined audience of spectral faces pressed close to the underside of the world, and how every shovelful of earth unearthed not only the past, but a compound weight of grief and memory that seemed to cling to skin and soul alike. It was as if the mountain itself was crying, she said in a voice that trembled. And we were trespassers in a place meant for mourning, not for hope. Her words lingered, repeated by others who had stood in the dark and felt the cold, damp breeze that seemed to carry whispers of things lost. Such beliefs are far from new in that part of the world. In the Philippines, where landscapes are steep and communities often live close to nature's moods, the boundaries between the seen and the unseen have long been regarded as thin and porous, especially in places where tragedy has struck. Ancient mythology speaks of Bathala, the creator deity, and of a host of lesser spirits who guard particular stretches of land. Diwata, Encanto, and ancestral ghosts who are said to watch over the living and to keep accounts of human actions. When disaster comes, it is frequently interpreted through these older frameworks as a sign that the balance between humans and the spirit world has been upset, that the land is reclaiming what was taken from it, or that restless spirits demand recognition and proper ritual. The motif of cataclysmic floods and earth-shattering landslides recurs throughout Filipino folklore, appearing in many regional tales and moral lessons. In Visayan myth, for example, the world was once covered entirely by water, and only through the intervention of deities, sometimes capricious, sometimes compassionate, did land emerge and allow people to survive. But those gifts were conditional in the stories. If humans forgot their duties to the land or to one another, if they grew heedless and disrespectful, the waters could rise again, or the mountains could fall. The lessons carried by these tales are practical as well as spiritual, reminding listeners that stewardship and reverence for the environment are essential to communal survival. In Guinsagan, these parallels between myth and recent reality are particularly chilling. Some elders whispered that the mountain had long been restless in ways people had chosen to ignore. There were stories, passed down quietly from parent to child, of a guardian spirit angered by the cutting of trees, the persistent digging of earth for road and housing projects, and the relentless noise and bustle of modern life encroaching on old moorings. Others spoke of omen-like signs in the days and weeks before the collapse, strange dreams that left people unsettled upon waking, animals inexplicably fleeing the forest in small, frightened groups, and flocks of birds dropping from the sky or falling silent at dusk as if hushed by an unseen hand. These memories and murmurs became part of the community's attempt to make sense of what had happened, a way to place the recent rupture within the longer arc of history and belief. After the tragedy, rituals were held to appease the spirits, drawing together a community desperate for comfort and for some measure of control over an event that had otherwise seemed senseless. Offerings of rice, flowers, and candles were left at the edge of the buried village, placed carefully on makeshift altars and scatterings of earth as neighbors and relatives whispered prayers and intoned blessings. Priests and babaylan, folk healers whose practices had long blended indigenous rites with Catholic devotion, prayed for the souls of the lost, asking the land to forgive and to remember, performing rites both public and private to honor those who had vanished. The Catholic faith, so deeply intertwined with older beliefs in the region, provided its own answers and rituals. Masses for the dead, processions of grieving families winding through the mud and standing rice paddies, holy water sprinkled over the site, and crosses planted in the muck as both markers and shields against evil, and as visible signs of mourning for a shattered community. But the most enduring stories came from those who searched for meaning in the smallest, almost imperceptible details. A rescue worker, exhausted after days of digging and listening to the groan of heavy equipment and the creak of splintering wood, recalled seeing a white butterfly hovering over the site, refusing to leave. In Filipino culture, butterflies are often seen as messengers from the afterlife, delicate carriers of souls and signs that the spirits of the dead are at peace, or, in other readings, signs that they are still waiting for closure, for prayers to be said, for names to be spoken aloud. Another volunteer, in a message submitted to a broadcast show chronicling the aftermath, described a night spent at the temporary shelter where survivors huddled on tarpaulins and under donated blankets. "We heard music," she wrote, "the kind you only hear during fiestas, faint and far away. There was no one playing, no electricity, no reason for it. Some said it was the children, still celebrating beneath the ground." That image of unseen celebration echoing through the ruined earth haunted listeners and offered a strange consolation, the idea that some part of the village's life persisted. The horror of Guensagon lies not only in the overwhelming scale of the disaster, but in its completeness and finality. There were almost no witnesses left to tell the story from within the catastrophe itself. The few who survived were those who happened, by chance or fate, to be away from the village that morning, working in the fields further out, visiting relatives in neighboring towns, running errands in the municipal center. For them, the return home was less a reunion than a descent into another world, one where familiar homes had been reduced to anonymous piles of timber and mud, faces and futures had been erased, and personal histories seemed suddenly inaccessible. They moved through the ruins with a new, hollowed sense of being, calling names that went unanswered, tracing the outlines of what used to be, and trying to stitch together a narrative from fragments. An effort to preserve memory, to assign meaning, and to assert that the people who had lived there were not entirely lost to oblivion. One survivor, Dario Libitan, recalled the sound as, like the mountain exploded and the whole thing crumbled. I could not see any house standing anymore. Another, Eugene Pilo, lost his wife, his children, everyone he knew. So many died. Our village is gone, everything was buried in mud. All the people are gone, he said, his voice still catching on the weight of that loss. In the difficult weeks that followed, the survivors struggled not only with overwhelming grief, but also with the practicalities of staying alive and trying to rebuild a semblance of daily life. The government stepped in and built new housing for those who had nowhere left to return to. But the tangible shelters could not immediately restore the invisible threads of community that had been severed. The landscape itself underwent a brutal transformation. What had once been a patchwork of flooded rice paddies, narrow footpaths, and clustered bamboo huts became an unbroken slope of fresh, displaced earth, with grass gradually growing over the bones of the lost. To the casual observer, the scars of the landslide softened and faded as vegetation returned. But for those who remained, the wounds persisted long beyond any visible recovery. Scientists and engineers studied the disaster carefully, hoping to extract lessons that might lessen the chance of a similar catastrophe in the future. They pointed to fractured bedrock, to the effects of deforestation that had reduced slope stability, and to broader changes in rainfall patterns, possibly linked to climate change, warning of a world growing more hazardous as long-established environmental and weather patterns shift. In response, disaster risk reduction became a frequent and urgent refrain in St. Bernard's planning sessions, and discussions about safer land use, early warning systems, and resilient infrastructure gained new traction. Importantly, the voices of the most vulnerable, women, children, and the poor, whose needs and perspectives had often been overlooked, were finally brought into the conversation and given a place at the table. The hope, slow and cautious, was that by listening, by planning thoughtfully, and by respecting both the land and the people who depend on it, The mistakes of the past might not be repeated, yet the land retains its own memory. On each anniversary of the tragedy, families make the trek to the edge of the old village site. There they light candles, offer prayers, lay down simple tokens, and call out the names of those who did not return. For a little while, the heavy silence that followed the event is broken, less by cries of despair than by expressions of love, by the careful keeping of memory, and by a collective refusal to allow those lost to be erased entirely. In the years since, new legends have grown up around Guasaga, gathering detail and weight like silt settling after a storm. Some say that on certain nights, if you stand very still and quiet, you can hear the distant sound of children playing, or the faint, tremulous echo of a bell calling students to class. Others believe that the spirits of the dead walk the fields at dusk and dawn, guiding farmers away from fresh danger, pausing at the terraces as if checking for the living, reminding them, with patient gestures, of the price paid for forgetting the land's warnings, and of the fragile balance between human habit and geological fate. There are darker tales, too, passed by word of mouth and in late-night conversations. Listeners have submitted accounts of dreams filled with mud and water, of hands reaching up from the earth as if begging or pleading, of faces glimpsed in mist and reflected in stagnant pools. A rescue worker, still haunted by what they saw in those first frantic days, spoke of a recurring vision, a line of children, their uniforms immaculate despite the ruin around them, standing in perfect order, waiting patiently at the edge of the buried school, eyes wide and unblinking, mouths open as if caught in a silent song, or a question that will not be answered. When the human mind is faced with a calamity so total and so sudden, it often turns inward, projecting the unbearable loss onto the external world in order to make sense of the senseless. The persistent sounds, the ghostly figures, the heavy, oppressive feeling in the air, these can be understood both as folklore and as the psyche's valiant attempt to process a collective trauma, a communal horror that refuses to be neatly filed away as history. The urge to believe that the lost are still nearby, still watchful, is at once a profound comfort and a necessary step along the long, arduous road of healing. It is a way of saying, you are not completely gone. You remain part of the landscape, part of our memory, and part of the story we tell so that forgetting does not become betrayal. A priest who ministered to the survivors recalled the challenge of offering comfort where none was possible. I told them that God grieves with us, he said, that every tear shed on that mountain was seen and remembered, but there are places where even prayers seem to vanish into the mist. This speaks to the powerful local view, where faith does not simply dismiss the terror but absorbs it, folding the tragedy into a complex understanding of a world where God and elemental nature hold equal, terrifying sway. It is a belief that sees the mountain not just as rock and soil, but as a wounded entity, a part of the divine creation that is both judge and graveyard. In the new Guinsagan, life goes on. Children are born, fields are planted, but the memory of the landslide is woven into every story, every superstition, every whispered warning to respect the land. The old village is gone, but its shadow lingers. The place, geographically, is marked by a deep, dark scar that tells an unavoidable story of vulnerability and the unpredictable power of the earth. The community built on the edge of that scar must now live with the constant, unsettling knowledge that their existence is conditional, dependent on the continued, silent agreement of the ground beneath their feet. Remember, you are always welcome to share your own stories with us at storiesphpodcast@gmail.com. Show notes and ways to support the show are in the description, and you can find exclusive content on Patreon Follow us on social media for daily folklore facts. As we end our story tonight, I invite you to remember those lost not as faceless numbers, but as neighbors, friends, children, and parents whose lives were as real and precious as any. Let their memory be a lesson, a warning, and a call to kindness for each other and for the land that holds us all. Now, as the night deepens and the shadows grow long, I leave you with a question. In a world where silence can be as loud as any scream, how do we listen to the voices that remain? As an old saying goes, the land never forgets, and the river always returns what it is given. Listen to more episodes of Stories Philippines, podcast for journeys into the dark and the unknown. Do not forget to like, subscribe, follow, and share this podcast. Support the podcast financially in ways you can find in the show notes. Thank you for tuning in, and goodbye.